changes everywhere. If you had to give the Gilded Age and the Second Industrial Revolution a bumper sticker or a slogan, um, I think it would be hard to do better than that. Where if you just kind of look around you, the changes that are taking place are like in your face. Let's say that the change that you observe between 1840 and 1880, I would say, is probably greater than the change that you see between 1640 and 1780. You get like decades and centuries worth of transformation um, just within really a single generation. Everything seems to change. And a lot of those changes are brought about by the American Civil War. But here's the irony: the Civil War was fought over the existence and spread of slavery, and of course, slavery was solidified and eventually emanated from the Southern states. Ironically, where you don't see as much change is in the South. And that we have a couple of questions that we have to ask. And some of you already know the answers to them, by the way. What is life going to be like for the approximately 3.5 million newly emancipated slaves in the South? And also, what is the future of the South going to be like? Because, of course, slavery supports this massive cash crop based economy. Well, what's that going to look like without slaves? So, this is going to incorporate a little bit of review as well as a little bit of new information as well. So, if you're looking at the South after the Civil War, you guys kind of know the basic points that there was this period of Reconstruction that was in the works. Nobody exactly knew what that was going to look like, including arguably Abraham Lincoln. There's a long, drawn out political fight over Reconstruction, which culminates in the presidential election of 1876, where Congress gets together and basically decides that in exchange for Rutherford Hayes being elected or selected president, Reconstruction would end in the South. So this also means that some of the other more radical visions of Reconstruction aren't realized. Property to freed African Americans isn't distributed, partially because many of the planters are pardoned. Also remember that during the 1860s and 1870s, you see the passage of black codes, which, among other things, are designed to roll back the clock and basically ensure that freed African Americans are slaves in all but name. And it was also very common at the state level for these black codes to demand that African Americans could only work as sharecroppers or tenant farmers. So, in other words, instead of working for slave masters, they're working for planters under contract. Is there a big difference between those two things? Well, it kind of depends upon the planter that you're talking about, but we discussed the fact that in many ways, tenant farming and sharecropping, which are kind of the same thing, they resemble slavery. And also the fact that, remember, even though we have Amendments 13 through 15, the 13th Amendment frees slaves. The 14th Amendment gives slaves citizenship and due process rights. And the 15th Amendment gives all American citizens the right to vote. But remember that all of these things notwithstanding, that in the 1890s, there's the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which says that despite what the 14th Amendment says, it is okay to discriminate on the basis of race, as long as, get ready to wrap your mind around this again, as long as that discrimination is equal. So, in other words, if there is a trade in which there is a whites only and a blacks only section, that is perfectly acceptable under the Constitution. So, it means that Jim Crow, which originates in the southern states, has the legal sanction to spread beyond the South, and does so in a number of different circumstances. So the question is, what is the step forward now? Because it seems like this is kind of a depressing bookend to the narrative of the Civil War. We're going to come back to that in just a second. But the other thing there is that slavery generally only exists if there's a cash crop economy to support it. And we know that many people in Congress and just in general have discussed the possibility of industrializing the South. And there's some efforts to see that happen. And to be honest, we can see evidence of, the South trying to industrialize all around us. If you guys have ever been up to Kannapolis, especially the downtown area, and you've seen all the mill, buildings and sites, etc. This is kind of the story of that time period, the attempt to industrialize the South. And this actually is called the New South, the idea that the South should abandon cash crop agriculture and embrace industrialization. Now, the term the New South is coined by a prominent politician and newspaper baron by the name of Henry W. Grady. And his emphasis is, again, to embrace, is to sort of embrace capitalism in the South. And remember that during the Gilded Age, we have this revolution of capitalism. So this shouldn't be all that surprising. But the question is, where do African Americans fit into all this? And even though capitalism is all about demand, it's all about free markets and free labor, Henry W. Grady also emphasizes that African Americans should in no way be equal partners in this industrialization. And so we have this attempt at industrialization, while we still have some of the same ideas of white supremacy. So that being said, in this time period, we do kind of see almost individuals similar to Southern robber barons emerge. So the South doesn't produce a J.P. Morgan or a John D. Rockefeller, but maybe you've heard of James Duke. And yes, by the way, it's that Duke. So James Duke was a Durham-born industrialist and capitalist that basically creates one of the world's largest tobacco companies. He buys out a British company called Imperial Tobacco, and basically he takes what was once the province of the planter class, and he monopolizes the tobacco industry in North Carolina. And in doing so, by the way, he amasses enough of a fortune to endow, among other universities, Duke University, Johnson C. Smith University, but he's kind of an example of the type of sort of homegrown business elite that emerges in the South during this time period. Again, if you guys have ever heard of Cannon Mills, Pilotex, this is also a period where James Cannon sort of starts a textile mill in Kannapolis. Now, keep in mind, though, a lot of these industrializing efforts still depend upon cash crops. You notice that James Duke is still heavily associated with tobacco. James Cameron, not the director, James Cannon is heavily associated with textile mills, which of course require cotton. So these capitalists that emerge in the South still rely upon cash crops in some way, shape, or form. The reason these industries emerge in the South during the 1880s is because of the principle of outsourcing. That's a politically divisive topic now, and really it's always kind of been a politically divisive topic. So what's happening is, remember that in northern states especially, that are heavily industrialized, wages are going up. And remember that that's an important point to remember about the Industrial Revolution. It's not that people are growing poorer. Wages are going up. It's just that working conditions and the quality of life isn't all that great. But as wages increase, it becomes more expensive to manufacture products. And so what happens is that Henry W. Grady and others kind of market the South as a potential way to for northern capitalists to outsource labor and pay workers for less. So even though the South is industrializing to a certain extent, you don't see quite the same trickle down effect that you do in the North. Remember, trickle down effect is the idea that as one part of society gets wealthier, that wealth will kind of trickle down to other parts. Uh, but the thing is that even though we do see evidence of that in northern states, we don't see evidence of that in the South. By the 20th century, wages of Southerners in general were about 40% less than in other parts of the country. Now, the South does industrialize eventually, not so much in the 1870s, but more so by the 1970s. There's a couple of different developments that lead to that. First, the invention of Freon and air conditioning, which is a plus. Second, though, is the fact that one of the things that kind of happens unforeseeably is the fact that industry in the North doesn't really contract, it grows. And partially that's because of the world wars. So eventually the fact that industry can be outsourced to the South more cheaply is what will spur that sort of second wave of industrialization in the South. But again, it takes a while. That being said, the question is, what is the next step forward for African Americans who are legally discriminated against because of Plessy versus Ferguson, and who in many cases can't get a job beyond sharecropping? And to answer these two questions, we have to introduce two individuals that you should be very familiar with: Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. It's not Dubois, by the way. These two individuals have two very different, very compelling visions of what the future should be for African Americans. However, these two visions are ultimately mutually exclusive. So let's talk about Booker T. Washington, who sort of precedes Du Bois by a bit. Today, among many historians, civil rights leaders, and politicians, Booker T. Washington gets criticized. And the reason he gets criticized is that he is seen as somebody who is willing to compromise with white supremacy and Jim Crow. And if you boil the story down to its basic facts, he kind of does. But obviously, it's not as simple as that. History is usually not so clear-cut. And we also have to understand who he was as a person before we can begin to analyze his ideas, let alone like criticize or praise him. So Booker T. Washington was born in 1856 in Virginia during a time period where slavery was in its death throes. During the Civil War, Booker T. Washington's entire family was able to escape to West Virginia, which was kind of the pro-Union side of the state. And they were able to earn their freedom, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, which supposedly when Booker T. Washington was informed of the Emancipation Proclamation by his mother, who openly wept when she was explaining what the day meant for the family. Washington also taught himself how to read, and you notice kind of a theme here that even though slavery is on his last legs, he starts with nothing. And in fact, Booker T. Washington, I mean, one of the reasons I think why we say like that entire name is that during his early life, like many slaves, he was simply known as being Booker by the slave master. What happens is that the T. Washington, the T actually is short for Taliaferro, I believe, which is his mother's maiden name, which was taken away from her by the slave master. And Washington was originally Booker's surname, which was, of course, not recognized by his slave master. So, in other words, we see like this conscious effort to build an identity, which I think once again kind of shows us just how evil slavery can be. It takes away the identity of the slave. So everything that Booker T. Washington does, really throughout his life, is in response to this experience of slavery. It's one of the reasons why he calls his autobiography Up from Slavery. But other than the Emancipation Proclamation, there's another very transformative event in his life. He goes to a school, basically like an ag and tech school, I believe in West Virginia. And even though he performs menial labor there, it's still this transformative experience. In his mind, education is what has given him some dignity and identity. And like I said, if you look at some of Booker's own sort of accounts of his experiences at that school, there's really not much to write home about. Again, he performs a lot of really menial labor, basically working as a janitor for some parts of it. And one of the things he talks about is just how mesmerized and how amazed he is about the fact that he's encouraged to bathe regularly. Again, it just kind of shows, it says less about the quality of education that Booker T. Washington receives and more about just how dehumanizing slavery actually was. So in his mind, education was kind of a miracle drug. And the way to resist both slavery and its legacy is for African Americans to have the opportunity to also be educated as well. In 1881, Washington founds the Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama, which becomes the nation's first vocational school for African Americans. And we should also kind of put this in context. Remember, the Freedmen's Bureau has been trying to educate African Americans because basically teaching African Americans how to read in the South was a crime in most places. And also remember that because of Horace Mann and a few other reformers, we're beginning to see a focus on just education more generally, because if you're going to have an industrialized economy, you need a workforce that's more educated. And we've also talked about the fact that schools give people skills and knowledge that they can use on the job, but also that the regimented life of school also prepares people for those types of jobs. And also remember that we see the transformative effect of capitalism and the fact that in northern factories, whenever we have labor strikes, for instance, northern capitalists and robber barons didn't think anything of basically replacing striking workers with low-cost replacements, derisively called scabs. And remember that many of these scabs were immigrants that were, in other cases, openly discriminated against. You see Leland Stanford, sort of championed the use of Chinese labor that could be paid less than white laborers. I mean, we see those instances across the board. And arguably, Washington realizes the fact that, at least on paper, capitalism, for all its problems, only really prioritizes wealth. That capitalism, it just is too efficient, too pragmatic to focus on ridiculous things like white supremacy and feelings of racial superiority. Now, we already talked about the fact that, in fact, that doesn't really work out in the South, but that essentially that you do see some capitalism, but at the same time, that doesn't exactly trounce white supremacy. But Washington, at least, is taken with the idea that if African Americans are educated and they're able to get decent jobs in the workforce, that on the whole, if you buy the idea that money is power, this is going to enable them to basically attain some level of equality with whites. And he basically lays out this very argument in the Atlanta Compromise or the Atlanta Exposition speech, which you have to, I think that you have to source and read. And he gives that in the year 1895. Now, the thing is that Washington, again, encourages African Americans not to challenge uh, basically Jim Crow laws and Redeemer governments openly. And there's maybe a couple of reasons why. One is that, again, Washington argues that that's not real equality without social change. And Washington also might think that, well, let's be honest. He was somebody who was well aware of the effect of Reconstruction and its failures. And remember that as soon as the Union leaves, as soon as the federal government basically allows for the return of home rule in the South, African Americans are once again excluded from public life. They're openly discriminated against, and Washington is one of many African Americans during that time period who becomes jaded by the experience. So, what does it really mean for political change to take place when politics, changes so sort of whimsically and unpredictably? So, his focus is on social change more than political change. Now, the thing is that many planters and white supremacists, they kind of agreed with this point of view. That to them, the idea that African Americans would focus narrowly on education and some and better wages, to them that was a much better bargain than African Americans focusing on obtaining political power and representation. So this is one of the reasons that Washington gets a lot of criticism today. Washington's most famous critic was W.E.B. Du Bois. So W.E.B. Du Bois is, in many respects, the model of what Booker T. Washington is looking for. You want somebody who represents the values of education and hard work? Well, W.E.B. Du Bois is your guy. Not only did he receive a bachelor's degree, which was pretty rare in those days, W.E.B. Du Bois is the first African American to receive a doctoral degree from Harvard. At a time where nobody got doctoral degrees. In fact, PhD programs were in their infancy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And yet, despite the fact that Du Bois is this guy where if he walks into a room, he just kind of like the attention shifts towards him because he's so brilliant. He's really a polymath. In other words, somebody who is exceptional in a wide variety of approaches and disciplines, including history, sociology, religious studies. He's such a widely read guy. And yet, at Harvard, he was openly spurned and discriminated against, where white students ignored him. He was rejected from joining a lot of extracurricular activities because of his race. And so that's kind of like your best shot. Like if the idea is that Washington has is that education is the key for African Americans, and that through education you could attain some level of social and maybe eventually political equality. Well, Washington basically did the best you could do, and it's still not enough. And yet, when he goes to study abroad in Europe, he actually, like many Americans during that time period, goes for to get basically advanced studies and take advanced courses in at graduate institutes in Germany. What he finds in Germany is that he doesn't quite have the same stigma. Germans sort of look at him as a curiosity and an oddity, but he's not openly discriminated against the way he is in the United States. Now, as you well know, in the 20th century, Germany has its own special history that involves discrimination against people on the basis of ethnicity and race. But at least at this point in time, let's say that African Americans were so rare in Germany that there wasn't kind of like a generally accepted way to treat them in Germany and indeed in many parts of Europe. By the way, African American combat troops in the world wars will receive that same kind of experience where they realize that actually life doesn't have to be like this. That when they go abroad to Europe, they're kind of treated as human beings, whereas in the United States, they really aren't. This is why Du Bois sort of attaches himself to the Niagara movement. And out of the Niagara movement, you have organizations like the NAACP. And this is kind of the most significant civil rights organization probably in the 20th century, or at the very least in the early 20th century. And Du Bois basically realizes that you can't really compromise with this. I mean, so if you compromise with white supremacy, yeah, maybe occasionally you might get somebody like Du Bois who gets a doctoral degree, but at the same time, that's not going to make much of a difference for the vast majority of African Americans. For those of you who have heard this expression, he kind of takes the approach that you can't negotiate with terrorism. That at some level, if you take the more accommodating approach, if you sort of embrace the idea that by compromising with Jim Crow laws and white supremacist state governments, you're basically incentivizing their behavior. So in his mind, the problem isn't a lack of education. The problem is the institutional racism that created that educational gap in the first place. And also, we have to kind of keep in mind that you could certainly be of the opinion that the educational gap wasn't the most important problem facing African Americans during this time period. Du Bois, being an educated person himself, certainly believed in the power of education. The phrase that we associate with Du Bois, or the concept that we associate with Du Bois, is he emphasizes the development of a talented tenth. Basically, roughly 10% of the African American population who will be highly educated, politically conscientious, who will sort of assume leadership roles within the African American community and civil rights organizations. So he wasn't against education, but how does education solve, for example, the Atlanta massacre, which took place in 1906, in which white supremacists kill and injure over 100 African Americans? And we have to be clear that this kind of stuff was what was going on in the Jim Crow South, and in some cases beyond the Jim Crow South. Booker T. Washington gives the Atlanta Exposition speech in 1895, and it's a speech that is praised by both some civil rights leaders, not Du Bois, and some white supremacists. Stranger things have happened. I can't think of many things that are stranger than that, but sure, stranger things, I guess, have happened. But yet, remember, the Atlanta Compromise is the idea that African Americans will surrender the pursuit of political equality in favor of obtaining some level of broader social acceptance and achieving, economic power. And then 10 years later, there is a massacre against probably many of those who cheered Washington on as he gave that original speech. So Du Bois would ask, how can you compromise with that? At some level, aren't you negotiating with terrorists? And in this case, not just metaphorically, but literally, the goal is to terrorize African American communities throughout the South. And even though Du Bois blames Washington for the Atlanta massacre is not a one-off. In 1898, in our home state of North Carolina, there is a coup launched by white supremacists to overthrow the duly elected legislature of North Carolina. The way this kind of happens is that throughout the 1890s, you might remember that suddenly poor whites start leaving the Democratic Party because other parties, like the Populist Party, have platforms and positions that more directly appeal to them. Because the Southern Democratic Party was a party that was kind of by and for the planter class during this time period. So it really didn't have much to say or anything to offer really to poorer whites. So what happens is throughout the 1890s is that North Carolina is one of the states in which African Americans still are able to vote, and basically Republican African Americans and white populists are able to elect a government that basically combines both parties together. They're called the Fusionists, by the way. This is more local history than you probably need, but what happens is that Southern Democrats are trying to figure out how to basically obtain power. And the answer is, well, you just simply prevent those people from voting. There is a local politician from Wilmington who basically incites an angry mob to attack African Americans and African American businesses. And the objective is to cower African Americans and the people who would vote for them. And ultimately, they're successful because suddenly Republicans and populists, well, they're too intimidated to speak out. Newspapers that are let's say, favorable to Republicans and African Americans and populists, they start shutting down or they're outright suppressed. And so in 1898, Democrats obtained control of the state legislature. And in the year 1900, a Southern Democrat by the name of Charles B. Aycock is elected. And he serves from 1901 to 1904. And he openly defends this insurrection that happens in Wilmington in 1898. And you want to know what's really creepy about that? I went to an elementary school from first through third grade that was named after this guy. Charles B. Aycock Elementary School, which is now since been demolished. And at least now, speaking for myself, no tears were shed. Anyway, going back to Du Bois's point, how can you compromise with that? A compromise implies that you have an agreement between two parties that are that are equally situated. And the thing is that incidents of racially motivated violence in the South and beyond the South demonstrate that that's just impossible. So we will see kind of a repeat, by the way, of the conflict between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. We sort of see this play out again with Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. In other words, Malcolm X, the situation is a little bit different, obviously, but Malcolm X is somebody who believes that racism should be resisted in any and every way possible, including using violent means, at least at first, because racism is fundamentally immoral. Martin Luther King, while he's not as accommodating as Booker T. Washington, at the very least, it takes the view that you kind of have to make some compromises and accommodations to basically create the greatest possible good for the people that you're representing. And some people today kind of have mixed opinions about which approach is more moral and which approach is more practical. It's a fascinating discussion on politics and ethics, but we also have to remember that this isn't just an academic discussion in a philosophy class. Ultimately, this discussion does impact the lives of real people. We also have to remember that in this post-Plessy versus Ferguson era, priority number one is not necessarily ending segregation. That would be phenomenal, but right now there are more immediate concerns, which include, by the way, the fact that lynching during this time period is widespread and is also extending beyond the South. During this time period, there is a race riot in the city of Springfield, Illinois. Springfield, that's the land of Lincoln, not exactly a state in the Deep South, and yet we do see that happen. So really, the NAACP is formed out of the Niagara movement, but its primary goal is to kind of speak out on lynching. Like, think about issues that need to be debated. The fact that lynching is something that even has to be intellectually critiqued is kind of absurd. Is the extrajudicial killing of people really on the basis of race? And so, actually, the most famous African American woman of this time period, Ida Wells, was a journalist who wrote about current events and history and criticized the extent of racially motivated violence. And she also noted the fact that any relationship between white women and black men was assumed to be a consequence of rape. And so many of these lynchings were justified on the basis of some, usually false allegation that a rape had sort of ensued. And by the way, this is kind of, if you've ever heard of the book To Kill a Mockingbird, this is trope is kind of represented in that book. But because of the spread of lynching throughout the South, you do see, starting in the 19 teens and 20s, a historically transformative process where, for the first time in American history, African Americans start to leave the South in large numbers. Of course, they flee during the Civil War. That's all true. But really, where you start to see the numbers really begin to change is in the 19 teens and 20s, where African Americans move north in order to basically take on factory jobs. And you can see that this happens very, very quickly. In 1910, almost 90% of the African American population lives in the South. By 1970, just really 60 years later, sorry, I can't add, 40 years, yeah, 60 years later, sorry, that number is reduced to about 50%. We'll talk about the consequences of that in the next unit. But until then, thank you guys and see you next time.